Hello and welcome to the Rewilding the Artist podcast, focusing on a culture of care in the arts, a place of inspiration, supporting you to bring a culture of care into your environment, whether you're a freelance practitioner or arts organisation. I'm your host, visual artist and changemaker, Gaia Redgrave.
Welcome everyone. Before we begin, I just want to explain that Gaia is currently unwell and unfortunately won't be with us for this recording. But the things we are about to discuss in the podcast are a direct result of an engaging and meaningful discussion that Gaia, Charlie, and I had towards the end of last year. There will be a podcast transcript in the show notes with hyperlinks to the references that we discussed.
For access purposes, the podcast structure will be as follows. We'll introduce ourselves and Resting Up Collective, followed by a practical exercise called Grounded Dreaming. We'll then discuss a series of questions related to how a culture of care manifests in Resting Up Collective.
Hi again. My name is Jennifer Bruff. My pronouns are she, they, and I'm a slow writer and workshop facilitator based in Nottingham. I write poetry and short stories that explore the body, pain, horror, using a magical and surrealist lens. I'm currently writing my first poetry pamphlet, Occult Pain, and I also review literature in translation. I envisioned and began Resting Up Collective.
Hi all again, my name is Charlie Fitz. My pronouns are she, they. I am a UK-based Sikh artist and writer. My work is rooted in a necessity to express and explore my lived experience of illness, disability, and trauma. At present, my work is concerned with heterotopic liminal spaces. I'm a founding member of Resting Up Collective and a director of the remote artist studio Triad.
So to introduce Resting Up Collective and what we do, I'll just tell you a little bit about us. Resting Up is an interdisciplinary group of chronically ill and disabled friends practicing slowness and crip time to create, think, interrupt neoliberal pressures and expectations on the body. Working at a slow pace, we operate on a who has capacity model to accommodate the different paces of our body minds. We've previously delivered free creative workshops online and in person. We're running the second iteration of a mail chain project this year, and we also share resources on protesting while sick and disabled. We're currently working with other disability organisations to continue this revolution from bed.
So we're all connected because of our overlapping energy-limited illnesses and or disabilities, but predominantly a desire to practice creative slowness and crip time. Within the collective, we also advocate for intersectional justice through a disability justice lens. Our group is made up of mostly queer, crip, precariat members. However, many of us have access to white privilege, some of us have access to cisgender privilege, none of us live in war zones, most of us live in a country with a welfare state, many of us are university educated, and some of us have access to healthcare that is free at the point of access. Therefore, we think it's important to situate the identities housed in our collective and recognise where we all have privilege, even from within a marginalised community.
Thanks, Charlie. So we're going to introduce our creative exercise now, and it's called Grounded Dreaming. And grounded dreaming is an idea that's been simmering in the background for a while, as we are both dreamers with wild, expansive imaginations, but rarely with enough capacity to creatively explore those imaginations.
Yeah, the idea found form in a conversation that Jen, Gaia, and I had, in which Jen suggested that we dream of an idyllic crypt space together. So using this space to imagine how things could be and try to translate and manifest these dreams into something compatible with our capacity in the waking world.
And the idea also came from something that Charlie is working on and suggested, which is about how we commune remotely. We can create a temporal liminal space or portal, or a heterotopic space.
And a heterotopia is an idea from the thinker Michel Foucault. It refers to spaces or worlds within our world that sit outside of time and space and the normal rules of society.
And as it's often the restrictive rules of society that create barriers for our community, the spaces we create together aim to challenge those typical rules and barriers.
Exactly. And so we suggested that when we meet up as Resting Up Collective online, or even now for this podcast, or when we met with Gaia before, we create these temporary portals into heterotopic crip community spaces.
So we're going to do the exercise now, and we'd like you to think of this as an invitation to dream with us and individually. So we're going to ask you to imagine a space to hold community. And for us, these exercises ask what kind of crip utopias we can make centered in a culture of care. So based on the prompt, think of how you connect with sick and/or disabled comrades and your community. Think, what are the barriers you face to this, and how would you remove them in a world with no restrictions?
We've chosen this particular idea because Resting Up Collective has given us a space to hold community with our crip comrades in a way we didn't know was possible when we first became sick. So Resting Up Collective began with Jen's ability to dream a space like this and her invitation to myself and others to dream collectively. You can engage with this exercise in any way you like. You can do it now, or you can come back to it at the end of the podcast, or even another day when you have more time to dream. We encourage you to pause the podcast after each question and take some time to really dream your space.
Exactly. Slowness is key here. So we'll be asking you to imagine the space. And for some people, this could be a completely meditative exercise in your mind's eye, while others of you may choose to write, draw, or audio record yourself speaking. We've also included these exercises as a Word document in the show notes so you can return to them later.
Firstly, make sure you're as comfortable as possible. Now, imagine somewhere you can hold space with your chosen community, whether that's friends, comrades, or the people, animal, plants you share your space with. Is this space physical or virtual? Does the space already exist, or is it completely of your making? Does it obey or break the laws of time and space? Is this space in the past, present, future, or even completely outside of time? Are you on the Earth, the moon, or an imagined planet? Does the space have a smell, sounds, or a visual representation? What does your space feel like? Now that you've created a space, how do you share it with your community?
And who are the members of your chosen community? Do you know them already? Are you yet to meet but have things in common? When imagining your shared space, think about how it accommodates all participants' capacity and access. For example, is this space the same for everyone who joins it? How do you invite people to join this space? How and when do you share this space? Are you there all together? Or is it more like a message board or collaborative exhibition where you all contribute and take part at your own pace?
How do you communicate in space? Are you communicating through words, images, sounds? Does your space act like the TARDIS in Doctor Who and automatically translate the languages of each participant? Perhaps the space is a frequency you can choose to tap into and communicate telepathically through. Now that you have dreamt of how to share your space with your chosen community, what do you do there? Do you share food, stories, art, knowledge? Do you create together? Are you connecting over a particular activity? Are you playing games together? Is it a space for organizing and activism? Is it a space to share and heal? How do you feel when you leave this space? Have you used or gained any energy? Has any time passed? Are you somehow nourished?
We don't want to impose any limits on this exercise, and your answers to these questions don't need to be finished or set in stone. These questions are a provocation, and this is an invitation to begin dreaming. So there doesn't need to be a finishing point, but we'll leave what the finishing point looks like open to you. We hope this exercise can offer you several things. Firstly, we want to invite you and give you permission to actively rest your body, mind, and dream of somewhere else. Escapism is often vital for survival.
It most definitely is. We're frequently told that rest is a privilege, and this is just not the case. We need rest for survival. And when it's taken from people, which it sadly frequently is, this is a breach of their human rights and basic needs. And we just want to make sure that we don't contribute to language that positions rest in this way, when it's frequently not optionable, enjoyable for disabled and chronically ill bodies.
Exactly. And secondly, we hope that this space can guide you about what you may want from your community and the barriers that you might be facing accessing this. Hopefully, this information can help you understand and communicate your access needs to friends, colleagues, family, and communities.
And we are aware that some of this may sound idealistic, but we hope by the end of this podcast, some of what we've spoken about can translate into practical tools as well as an important invitation to active rest.
I actually feel much more rested now and calm following even just talking through that.
I do as well. We were speaking before this and we were both quite ill today, so I think we both needed that.
Yeah. And for the next part of the podcast, we're going to be having the discussion of just what we're about, really. So I'm going to pose my first question to you, Charlie, which is to understand how collective dreaming connects to a culture of care. How can we house collective dreaming and use it to create in real life?
So, to allow for grounded dreaming, finding a community is a great way to begin. In a time when so many bodies are policed, coded, stuck in capitalism, we feel the community and the friendships grown there are vital for survival.
Exactly. And our friendship wouldn't have happened if it wasn't for an example of this.
Exactly.
And it's something we try and recreate in the workshops that we've previously run. And sometimes we found that people who may not have identified as disabled or chronically ill or members of the precariat because they didn't feel sick or mad or poor enough might for that short time feel seen and continue to engage with us. And I think having the permission to just down tools and rest or dream in a guided setting can be really liberatory from the everyday drudgery.
Yes. Yes. And creating or attending spaces that allow for these moments of freedom and recognition can act as interruptions to the dominant structures that govern so many of us. Even formulating the exercise in our initial conversation with Gaia was this enjoyable act of communal dreaming. I remember we all felt like uplifted after that, or I did.
No, definitely. And I think just making these moments of pause it feels groundbreaking, but they don't need to have an outcome as well. Like even just having the conversation about what worlds can emerge
Mhm,
is enough, you know?
mhm.
So for the next part, we're going to talk and offer some examples of how grounded dreaming can be used as a practical tool a tool for community organizing?
So, although this type of collective dreaming is not necessarily a go-to for many spaces, I think that we can take some really important things about access and community away from this exercise. I would suggest that it can even be used as an approach to understanding our own access requirements and writing something like an access rider, which can feel like a really daunting task. If anyone doesn't know what an access rider is, we've put a hyperlink to some information about that in the transcript, which is in the show notes. So, for example, when I do this exercise, I'm always, when I'm like dreaming my own space, I'm always connecting to my community telepathically from my sick bed. So, with that in mind, I have on my access rider that where possible, I need to work remotely. And for an organization hosting any sort of creative or community event, this could translate into thinking about how the event could be made hybrid so that participants can also join remotely.
Exactly. And because this exercise asks participants to think about how they access a space and how they communicate in a space, it also draws on what sensory input is necessary, what makes participants comfortable in a space, the things they might like to do as an activity, and also the energy that even being within a space requires and how that can impact on people afterwards. So we'd say that if you are running a community space or hosting an in-person event, you could even use this exercise to think imaginatively beyond and inclusive of the usual access tools and barriers people face.
Yeah. So, for example, someone with sensory sensitivity may imagine a space with low sensory input, a quiet, scent-free space with low light. So, can you replicate this space in your event? Perhaps make the event perfume-free and, where possible, have a quiet, low-light sensory break room.
And if you are hosting any sort of remote or in-person event, meeting or creative workshop, consider making the space a relaxed venue and actively advertise that it will be a relaxed space. Relaxed spaces, such as relaxed performances, allow people to be however they need to be in a space without fear of reproach for not following society's usual etiquette of going to the theatre, an art gallery, etc. We've included what a relaxed venue and a relaxed performance can look like as well, which is also hyperlinked. So for remote events, this could look like people accessing the event from bed or eating during the event, having their cameras off or on, and allowing people to leave for breaks or just leave early.
Yeah. And for in-person events, knowing an event or venue is relaxed could encourage participation from neurodivergent people, people whose behavior is often misunderstood and reproached in kind of formal spaces. So if you know, and in addition to that, if you know the participants beforehand, reach out, make space for them to offer their specific access needs and ask what will make them comfortable in the space. So the grounded dreaming exercise is not just an invitation to dream, but it's an invitation to dream of accessible futures. And I want to encourage anyone organizing to educate themselves on and use the tools that already exist, but also to invite the disabled community to dream of other access tools and ways to remove barriers. When I do this exercise and dream of my accessible utopia, my key takeaways for allowing my sick body mind to sustain community are flexibility, active consent, both mine and other participants, and respecting my own and others' capacities. And this can be translated into how I organize and communicate with friends, collaborators, colleagues, and peers in multiple ways. But it's also demonstrated in how Resting Up Collective communicates and organizes.
Yeah, or at least we actively try and maintain it that way. And when we begin a new exchange or collaboration within the collective, we aim to demonstrate from the outset that there is this mutual flexibility and respect for each other's capacity by stating that we can reschedule meetings as many times as either of us needs to without judgment, or maybe just not have a meeting at all, as is often the case, just texting or emailing.
Yeah, this has been a really, really big thing for me, like a game changer. Like having other people legitimize that behavior and that need has been really big. But also when I'm communicating via email, or when people in the collective are communicating via email, some of us in the collective have automatic email responses or email endings with a disclaimer about needing flexibility and longer time to respond. And this is something I've not just seen in the collective, but in the disabled community, like wider. And so having that automatic email response or email ending just gives you that little bit more flexibility, and kind of allows the other person to know that you need that. So for example, mine says, as a sick, this is at the end of my email, as a sick and disabled person, I run on crypt time, so there may be delays in my email responses unless the email is urgent, which I got from another disabled friend and adapted to myself.
And I think that's really useful, like you say, communicating within the sick community, but also just so useful for people who aren't in that sick community and may not know what crypt time is or like what crypt means. And it just is a small interruption and a way of encouraging people just to Google these terms that have become so second nature for us as well. So in Resting Up, we have a very loose system for communicating capacity, in which maybe someone will put an idea or a project suggestion into the group WhatsApp or email chain. And if people would like to participate, they only need to respond with an emoji, something really simple that requires minimal effort. And we also allow people to step in and step out. Sometimes people go off grid entirely with very little explanation needed, because we accept that all of us have times where we can't communicate or take part in projects because of the way our bodies are. And there's no judgment there. And in that, I think we've grown a nice little ecosystem of care and support and a radical acceptance, because none of us want to replicate the feeling that so many of us have experienced of feeling like a failure because of our illnesses and lack of capacity.
And I think now it seems so normal to us, but if you were in another setting, like a work setting, and someone put forward a project and you just responded with an emoji, that could be taken really badly. But it's so, like, it is quite a big deal being allowed to just respond with an emoji, know that no one's going to be offended, it's, you know, there's no judgment, and that tiny bit of energy is all you needed to do to show your interest. Like,
Exactly.
it is a bigger deal when I really sit and think about it. Anyway.
No, totally. And like, even just imagine a normal working environment where you're like, actually, I don't really have capacity to do my assigned task, but I might be doing it between like 12 and 1 tonight when I have insomnia.
Yeah.
Like, they'd be like, no, we don't pay you for that. I think the way in which, you know, disabled and chronically ill bodies have capacity to work is so varied and can look like anything. And I just think we're not set up as a society to embrace all of these different types of working. It's often seen as a nice to have or an unnecessary.
Yeah, absolutely. People don't realize how kind of profound and radical acceptance of that can be. And I think that's one of the things that Resting Up has really given me, of being like, no, it's okay to be like this. You're not like less valuable as a person for needing to navigate the world like this.
Definitely. And like, work is still work, however it gets done. And also, we're not, you know, I think this is one of the problems in activist spaces, which I think we're going to talk about later, which is someone needs to do the work, and that's the issue. When you're anti-work, how do you make sure things happen, right? Without judgment. But yeah, I'm sure we'll get on to that.
100%. That is very important. We're putting a pin in it because we're coming back to it. So the next thing that we wanted to talk about was something that is really at the heart of Resting Up, I think. And it's this question: intersectional thinking is essential to our culture of care in Resting Up. So Jen, can you explain how disability justice is a gateway to intersectional thinking?
Yeah, this is something we think about quite a lot. And I even sent a non-disabled friend this kind of explanation today. But we are in alignment with Patty Byrne, who is a disabled activist and the co-founder of Sins Invalid. And we think that using the disability justice framework calls attention to the ways that ableism is linked to multiple other systems and symptoms of oppression. So while disability justice, as the name suggests, centres disability in its approach, it's not a single positionality. And to quote Byrne again, this movement aims to centre disabled people of colour, immigrants with disabilities, queers with disabilities, trans and gender non-conforming people with disabilities who are houseless, people with disabilities who are incarcerated, and people with disabilities who have had their ancestral land stolen, amongst others.
So, in listening and learning from people's lived experiences from different positionalities, the disability justice movement encourages us to trace interlinking oppressions. Everyone will approach disability justice from their specific experience, but as we mentioned, hierarchies still exist within minority groups, particularly with white disabled creators and activists receiving more coverage than others.
Exactly, or illness memoirs or exhibitions predominantly being commissioned from white practitioners, for example. So while actively choosing to broaden the types of content you engage with, corporations like Instagram can still shadow ban certain creators or topics, meaning that these hierarchies are replicated and often involve going into several sub-menus, like on Instagram, for example, that allow you to see political content, which is often, probably maybe not from creators that will be on your explore page, amongst the knitting and cat memes.
We've also included a link to the plain text version of Sin's Invalid Disability Justice at this point in the podcast script, so there's a hyperlink there as well. So the next question that we were going to discuss is Resting Up Collective's purpose, how it began, and how the collective enacts a culture of care.
Yeah, so we've spoken a little bit about this previously, but just as a background as to how Resting Up was born and how you can make similar organisations or join us or take whatever you want from our loose model of organising. Resting Up was born out of being sick for a long time and feeling really isolated, particularly in lockdown, and not necessarily having the language to describe what I was feeling and even meet similar people on my day-to-day existence who were going through similar things. I felt maybe not sick enough to call myself disabled. So I began researching disability groups, resources, texts, artists, anything that I could get my eyes and brain on, basically. And I contacted a few people who I knew were already active in the disability world, whether that was through art or writing, and just waited to see who got back, really. And then we went from there.
Did. And I was one of the people that you contacted.
And you sure were.
I'm eternally grateful for that. And so once we kind of started and there was a good group of us, we wanted to create a place for creative work by and for sick people in a live way to complement magazines and online online resources on illness and disability. So while we've spoken about some of the ways we make our events as care orientated and as accessible as possible, we also, try to govern ourselves in a similar way.
Exactly. And we have I'd say a group of maybe about 13 of us, and any one of those members can drop in and out. It's a completely open organization. Anyone can ask to join, obviously providing their values align with our disability justice lens and our kind of code of conduct, which is available on our Substack. But basically, we try and operate with a flat structure. So anyone can bring ideas to the table or pitch in projects, and we can respond depending on our capacity. We try to do semi-regular text or voice note check-ins and make sure our meetings don't last for more than an hour, because for us, that flexibility and inbuilt slowness is key to how we work and organise. For example, working on this podcast was slowness in action. You know, we debated back and forth between us for a while. There were parts when we were both sick, and it really does rely on external people being flexible, like Gaia was, and, you know, the whole team allowing us to push this back when we needed to.
Most definitely. We had to move the recording date back a few times, the same with internal meetings due to our fluctuating capacity. We were discussing this morning whether we were well enough to do it, and we decided that we just about were. Um, and so the way that we worked on this, due to our fluctuating capacity, was that I kind of worked on the first draft of the script for a bit, and then Jen worked on it, and we both went back and edited, and both came in at different times, and then texted a lot whilst we were doing that. And over about the course of 2 months, we kind of then had the whole podcast transcript fully formed, which was like a really, for me, was a really good way to work. I don't know about you, Jen.
Definitely. I mean, I love a Google Doc with shared access. Like, you know, anyone can go in at any point and just add a little idea, you know, flesh it out. And I think that kind of, like we've been talking about, that inherent flexibility in when your mind is on and when your body is on, those two things don't often align very often. So even just like going into a document and writing like, speak about care in collective here, and then revisiting it, you know, like bullet pointing ideas and maybe texting each other. And I think a lot of our communications as a collective are very scattered across voice notes and documents and these things. And this was a really wonderful act that Charlie kind of wrangled into one place, which then allowed me to work on it in a more careful and caring way, I think. So the next thing we want to talk about, which we've sort of touched on, is the challenges we experience creating and maintaining this culture of care and resting up, which we think it's important to acknowledge in activist spaces and general spaces of just maintaining communication and care.
Most definitely, because the challenges are, you know, they're a real big issue. And so one of the issues I experienced with labour and productivity as a sick person, that I think many of us in Resting Up experience, is this kind of internalized ableism and capitalist mindset in which we feel as though labour contributions equal individual kind of personal worth. And so although I and the collective reject this notion wholeheartedly, individually, many of us still feel unworthy because of how embedded this idea is in our society. And for me, it kind of comes in waves. I get my head around it and I feel, you know, I feel comfortable with it. It's a bit like grief. And then I have a wave where I'm really struggling with it again.
And I think that kind of saying sorry as well is something we tell each other not to do, but we do it all the time. It's like, oh, sorry, I haven't worked on this, or sorry, I've been a bit incommunicative. And yeah, a lot of undoing.
It's very
constantly.
hard to get out of this, isn't it? And I often bring this feeling into my labour for the collective, feeling guilty when I don't have capacity to contribute, as I think many of us do. As a part of our culture of care, we must find ways to counteract the productivity mindset and guilt it brings for ourselves and our members. And I think not saying sorry is kind of one of these reminders, right?
Exactly. We're trying. I think, yeah, we're both very sensitive people, so we're used to feeling guilt and needing to apologize a lot.
Yes.
But like from the practical perspective of setting up and running Resting Up, like we've said, I'm so keen not to replicate those hierarchical structures of organizations. You know, even if I end up being like head sick wrangler, I'm still a sick person myself, you know. And while that flexibility and slowness is the main strength of how we work together, it could also be perceived as a weakness, you know, in a business capacity or like external views, because it can be hard to work when we're all sick and tired. And oftentimes we need to prioritize paid work in addition to our work outside the collective, because as Charlie mentioned earlier, a lot of us don't have full-time jobs or maybe juggling multiple part-time jobs. And I think one way that we try and, you know, grapple with this is accountability, which is something I think about a lot. And even from the beginning, when we were first having meetings in 2021, which feels like forever ago, I've always tried to call for, if people have suggestions to do things differently, if the current mode of working isn't working, and if we can collaborate in different ways, and out of that, things like switching to email or colouring documents with different backgrounds for easier reading and prioritising opportunities in spaces that align with our values rather than replicate hierarchies is something that's come out of that gentle collaboration and meeting.
Yeah, definitely. And although we recognize our need to make money to survive, one of the important things that has come out of Resting Up and contributes to our culture of care is that we talk about our relationship to internalized capitalism more frequently. We're constantly coming up against the idea I mentioned about progress and a strong work ethic that many people live by. And rallying against that is a tension we continue to navigate collectively and as an individuals. And I hope, as a collective, we validate each other's worth in a way that is completely separate from capital and productivity, or at least we're working towards that.
And as you said, it is like being in an ocean of that constant tension, like the push and pull of a tide, and it coming in waves. And sometimes you get your head around it, and then other times, just being in a world which is navigated and governed by that structure means that you replicate it unintentionally. I recently read this Jean Baudrillard quote, which is, "In a system where life is ruled by value and utility, death becomes a useless luxury and the only alternative." And I was thinking about that and how the government, particularly under austerity and in the pandemic, has and continues to code certain bodies as invaluable due to their, quote, economic inactivity, which inherently discards disabled lives. Like, we live in a country, for all its purported privileges, has seen 330,000 deaths linked to austerity. And the last thing we want to do in our group or those who we work with is reproduce those unrelenting structures, because capitalism is a death machine. Like, it just is. And I don't want that in my tiny laptop or amongst my circle of friends as much as possible.
Yeah, we need this to be an interruption and a break from that. And even, more than that, even a dreaming of how things could be different.
Exactly. And also seeing dreaming as not a useless activity. Like, dreaming is sustaining, dreaming is escapism. And while we may be not necessarily at the coal face of struggle, sometimes our like collective struggles, sometimes even the individual things we experience of in our lives, like through medical systems, through getting up out of bed of the morning, those are struggles. And linking all of our body minds together and validating our body minds is sometimes all you need. Like, you can't do much more than that,
100%, 100%. I think that those little check-ins that we have, even when we're not super productive, really are so important. Just having that connection, because often there'll be times where a lot of us are unwell at the same time, and I wonder if it's something to do with the environment or something that's going on, and just having that little or stuff that's going on in the world, just having that little check-in is really radical, I think, and having that community. So all of what we've just said is why we encourage slowness in all our output as a collective. And this might be really disorientating for organizations we work with. Although I think we've been quite, and maybe this is in part who we attract and who Jen reaches out to, or who everyone reaches out to. I think we've been quite lucky with the organizations we've worked with, but it can be disorientating for organizations that aren't used to this. And who have a more usual kind of schedule, but flexibility and slow working is an access requirement for the collective to function with a culture of care. Our individual and collective capacity must be accepted in good faith. And so I'm using this this word from one of Gaia's previous podcast episodes, where Gaia interviewed Nick Cherryman. And we really connected with the discussion of the good faith agreement, both as a tool to create safe spaces which allow for error and learning, as well as a tool for setting boundaries and accepting each other's boundaries and capacity.
Exactly. And I mentioned earlier that we have a sort of very, very loose code of conduct on or like rules of governance or something that has an official name, but is just like how we interact with each other. And I think we're talking about expanding that to include the good faith agreement, because at the moment we have a kind of, we have a practice of using reparative justice. So if a harm is committed by someone in the group, then we will resolve it collectively. And there's a bit of a discussion on how you can use reparative justice on our Substack. But yeah, I think those two things in conjunction with each other and operating in a model where, you know, none of us want to cause harm or reproduce harm, and simultaneously we are all operating on the same page is really useful to have. So we're reaching the end now. So at the end of every podcast, Gaia asks participants what they would like people to take away from their approach to the culture of care. So Charlie, can you summarize our key takeaways, please?
Yeah, so the first one, labour contributions do not equal individual worth, especially in activist and creative collectives. That's something that we spoke about throughout, but I think it's really important. And the second key takeaway, flexibility and slowness are legitimate access requirements that can and should be embedded into organisations and paid work. That might be a bit of a stretch for organisations at the moment, but I think that that's really important, especially arts organisations that are listening to this. They really need to start to think about flexibility and slowness and how to meet those needs. The third one, the third key takeaway, grounded dreaming, which is what we demonstrated earlier, can be used as both a tool to explore access requirements and as an invitation to active rest. And the final one, rest is vital and should not be considered a privilege.
Absolutely. And that's us. So thank you for listening, and you can follow Resting Up on our linked Substack or Instagram, and the handle for the Instagram is @restingupcollective_.
Thank you so much for listening. It's been
Thank you. Rest well.
This podcast sits within the Rewilding the Artist project, an innovative journey to equity and authentic self-expression, kindly supported by the Arts Council of Wales Lottery Fund. This podcast can be found on Spotify and YouTube. You can find Rewilding the Artist on Instagram and further resources on the website. All links can be found in the description. Thank you for listening and enjoy the journey.